I always thought that in some ways, freedom in America is born in the neighborhood at Play. And I noticed earlier, John showed something from Peanuts. There's a chapter in my book about freedom and Peanuts, the cartoon. If you read Peanuts, there's one really important thing that's missing. It's parents. These are kids on their own, experiencing life, taking on risks, playing games, making rules in their own world without overweening authority. And to me, Peanuts is about young children learning how to live with ordered liberty. Liberty without order is license. Liberty with the proper kind of order is freedom. And so, that's one reason I really like Peanuts. Now, several times in my life, I've changed my mind in meaningful ways. And this can mean one of at least two things. First of all, something Chesterton said about in response to John Stuart Mill. He said, open-mindedness can be good, but make sure it doesn't become open-mindlessness. That in other words, don't just listen to every idea and nod your head, but use critical judgment in responding to it. The idea of open minds can also mean, however, something more positive. And that's the willingness to learn, the willingness to take on new challenges. And I think that's very important in a complex world, and especially when it comes to higher education, which is all about exposure to new things. But when I was young, I suffered from what my father called acute incuriosity. And I didn't read books. If John would have known about my background, he wouldn't have invited me to give this talk, at least my background as a child. I was what my father called a conscientious non-reader. And this is something I eventually had to overcome. For me, books were like kryptonite. And I remember kind of imagine in my head, if I was playing basketball, I played a lot of basketball very competitively. And if my opponents would have picked up a book when I was really young and thrown it at me, the game would have been over because it's like kryptonite to me having to read a book. So something changed along the way. And it's an example, I think, in your lives, how you really never know what's coming before you. You never know what path you're going to take. Keep your minds open, both in terms of learning and experience. Now, in my book, I talk about citizenship in a constitutional democracy. And one of the keys to democratic character, as I portray it in the book, is the balance between conviction and due doubt, I call it. And Mill himself, if you read On Liberty, he's disdainful of people that have no convictions. You need to form beliefs to have something you stand for in this world. At the same time, he's critical of those who are dogmatic and never test their beliefs or never open themselves to new experiences and ideas. So the kind of citizenship that Mill has in mind and On Liberty, which I think is related to the citizenship that our Constitution embodies, is one that properly balances conviction and doubt. Without too much doubt, then you become a worrywart, and you don't stand for anything. You let bad things happen. But if you never have any doubt, that can be very problematic in itself. So you think about our Constitution, the checks and balances in the Constitution, the freedoms in the Constitutions, balanced by the fact that the Constitution also empowers the government to make certain policy decisions that are based on conviction. It's a balance. But the balance only works if disagreement is tolerated. Disagreement is woven into the Constitution's DNA, in my mind. So let me go back briefly again and talk about some of the changes I've made in life, just 4. At one time in life, I was a big Bear fan. And today, I'm a diehard Raider fan. And if that offends you, you're free to leave the room here. I can understand that. But fact is a fact. Also, as I mentioned, before I was 20, I was a conscientious non-reader. And I did, however, love science and math. And of course, science and math are very important to any kind of learning, to social improvement and development. A big fan of science and math. But back in the day, things like public affairs, literature, history, anything that hinted at intellectual culture, I just had no time for it. But then I changed in college. Started out with math and some science, but then I gravitated toward these other kinds of subject matters because of the teachers that I encountered and because of the events that were happening back in the 60s that drew my interest so much. So the point for you in liberal education is that how you start may not be how you finish, or how you start may not be where you end up going. Keep an open mind to that. To try to experience various things. College is about learning how to deal with the world, getting a job, absolutely, especially given the high cost of higher education today, which is a whole different topic we could talk about some other time. But it's also a time to kind of experiment if you can. You never know where you're going to go. I've also changed my political affiliation 3 times. And done this, there are different reasons for this. Either I changed, which I did somewhat, or the party's changed. You know, if you follow what Elon Musk has said about himself in party affiliation lately, he said, I stayed the same, party changed. Or it can be a combination of 2. I live in a swing state, and I'm a swing voter. And to be honest, what I'm really looking for in this particular election is a challenge to the parties, so the parties realign in a way that I think will make more sense to the various currents and cross currents that are going on in America. I think both the Republican Party and the Democratic right now are in a process of ferment. And I'm somewhat hopeful about how that works out, even though it's going to be pretty chaotic in the meantime. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, I changed my mind about free speech and restrictions on campus. The first book I wrote was called Nazis and Skokie. And I took a fairly restricted view towards free speech. And when I came to Madison back in the mid-1980s, and the first round of speech codes started coming about, I actually supported them. And I voted for them in the faculty senate. And several years later, I was one of the leaders in a movement that brought down the speech codes on campus, in particular the faculty speech code, which was the first time that anyone knew about in which a university did away with the speech code without being required to by a court. So that was a dramatic kind of change in my life. It changed my research. It changed how I interacted with the people on campus. It changed my career in many ways. And in some ways, that's another theme. It was a First Amendment set of issues that drove me, but that very process, that very change was partly a First Amendment kind of story in itself, because as an example of somebody listening, responding to what's going on, and finding a set of reasons to change their minds. And I should mention that one of the major reasons I changed my mind about speech codes was students of mine who were very good students from across the board politically and in terms of identity. And they didn't like the speech codes either. And they kept encouraging me, hey, Downs, join us. We can make a difference on this campus in terms of free speech. And so that led to my ultimate involvement in these issues, both on campus and outside the campus. So this is a core point in the book as well. Life's an adventure, intellectually, experientially, and emotionally. And it can lead to, who knows where. You never know what's going to turn out. Now, truth, which is a vital thing in itself, and a linchpin of a free society, is elusive and never completely grasped by even the most knowledgeable and wise person. I think, Bob Dylan had wait, do Dylan a second here. This is what I call the paradox of freedom and truth. Truth is fundamental, but it must always be challenged in order to revive itself, to sustain itself, and because of the fact that we are imperfect receptors of truth and perceivers of truth. John Stuart Mill has a famous line, something related to what John had talked about earlier, in which he said that truth itself must be challenged in order to stay alive in us. So Mill believed that most truths were still open to question. And I'll give you an example of that shortly, just 4 out of millions of examples. But Mill did concede there are some truths that even if they are forever, empirical truths, the Holocaust either occurred or it didn't. Okay, we know it did. Moral truths. Will it ever be acceptable by reasonable and moral people to torture children? That kind of thing. We have certain truths that we consider absolute for good reasons. But Mill said if we don't allow them to be challenged and therefore have to defend them, they don't stay alive in our heads and in our hearts. Mill understood that the pursuit of truth is not purely an intellectual thing, but also an emotional thing, because we are emotional people as well as intellectual people. And this makes me think of Plato's comment that a philosopher is someone who should love truth with one's heart and with one's mind. Mill understood that. Another political theorist named Dana Villa wrote a book on what he called Socratic citizenship. And he argued in this book that even absolute moral truths need to be challenged. Otherwise, they could become immoral in themselves because they become dogmatic and intolerant of any kind of dissent. And I think also a third kind of interesting quote is that by Churchill. I'm not sure whether Churchill really said this or whether or not it was attributed to him, but he was talking about America in relationship to policy and pragmatism. And he said, America always gets it right in the end after it's tried everything else. And I think that's a wonderful comment about human fallibility and the struggle to get it right. And you can't get it right in the end if you don't challenge and question and tolerate disagreement. It's impossible. So I think Churchill's alleged comment is a real tribute to the pragmatic spirit that is part, America was the country that was the foremost advocate of pragmatism as a political philosophy and a scientific and a philosophy of knowledge. And it's also very much related to the idea of freedom of speech and why we have it. And then fourth, there's Lincoln, which is very appropriate to talk about him today because it's his birthday. So happy birthday, Abe. And Gettysburg Address, Lincoln said that we were conceived as a new nation in liberty, dedicated to the proposition that all men and of course all women and everyone are created equal. Lincoln is a special case because Lincoln, I think he's our greatest president. I know John harbors that idea too. And I can't recall another president that was, on one hand, most dedicated to the meaning of American freedom and how it can be a beacon for the world, but also the most critical of America's sins involving slavery. Lincoln's an example of somebody who could criticize America to its core, while also loving it and wanting to redeem it and to lead it, and understood how we are conceived with liberty. Now, this is not an example of moral relativism. Moral relativism is in which we don't make any judgments about truth or untruth. There's a distinction in philosophy between ontology and epistemology. Ontology is the study or pursuit of what is true. Epistemology is the study of how we know things It deals with our own kind of mental apparatus and how we understand, how we know. And one can argue that there's ontologically truth, but epistemologically not truth, or not epistemologically, truth is question, a way of putting it, because of the imperfection of our minds, the imperfection of our natures. Knowledge is often distorted by self-interest, by prejudice, by bias. You look at the history of scientific discovery, tremendous competition among schools of thought, vying for scientific prominence. So that's just part of of human nature. But by the same time, by the same token, truth does or can exist if we work hard enough and strive for it. But we must constantly bear in mind that it's contingent, except in the most extreme, obvious cases, especially logical cases. 2 and 2 is 4. You can't really refute that. There are a few examples I'll just give you of how settled consensual truth has been disproved by subsequent knowledge and challenge. Ptolemy once believed that the Earth was the center of the solar system, of the universe. It was geocentric. And along came Copernicus. Through great pressure and previous people being burned at the stake, claiming no, the Earth is not the center, the sun is the center of the solar system. Copernicus represented a scientific revolution where one paradigm replaced another. And then you had Newtonian mechanics, which governed all physical knowledge of physics. And eventually that was surpassed, not replaced by, because Newton still has relevance within certain domains of inquiry, but by Einstein and quantum physics, which replaced even Newtonian mechanics. In 1898, the United States Supreme Court ruled that Illinois could constitutionally prohibit women from becoming lawyers. That's a real case. Well, a few decades later, that case was overturned. What happened? Women started pushing for their rights. Society started changing. Can you imagine a case like that being decided today? All hell would break loose, and properly so. Domestic violence at one time was considered consensually a private matter that should not be of public concern. That changed starting in the 1970s as women started organizing and showing why this is a matter of very significant moral matter and criminal matter in many cases. It's something that became a public issue. Drunk driving was once considered kind of a funny thing almost, or not a major public issue anyway, until Mothers for Drunk Driving and others started becoming active, using their free speech. And then it became a major kind of public issue. Those are just some examples among many others. Now, how does this tie to the university? Our democratic republic is with different institutions that are engaged in the pursuit of truth, along with their own interests. We have all sorts of organizations, think tanks, private organizations, interest groups. Others are all striving for their own kinds of truths. The criminal justice system is really predicated on that. Criminal process leading to a jury in a trial, or even a conscientious form of plea bargaining. Plea bargaining can be both good and bad depending on how it's done. And they're all based on trying to find the truth. In the book, in the chapter on why free speech matters, I talk a bit about the jury process and how the character involved in supporting free speech is similar to the kind of character we like to see in a juror. If anyone out there has ever been a juror, think about what your obligation as a juror is. To sit and listen to the evidence. You're getting it from both sides. And then you're supposed to sift and winnow it and come to a consensual, often unanimous agreement as to, one, what happened, and two, the culpability of the defendant in the case for action, if indeed the defendant is linked to that action. it requires leaving your biases and your prejudices aside and opening your mind to what might be an uncomfortable truth. It might be a serious crime. You might think the defendant is a schmuck, but your duty there is to determine whether or not the defendant is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. That's sort of the frame of mind that democratic citizenship requires, and that the model of freedom of speech is meant to fulfill. Okay, so that's I think is one of the major institutions in America where truth matters. And then, of course, we have the university, and I think universities, colleges, higher education in general, they are the institution that is most prominently predicated on the pursuit of truth and knowledge, and that therefore must be open to free debate, free inquiry, and questioning. The process of free inquiry is indispensable to higher education. Now, in the book, if I'm right, then this process of the university means that the university has a central role to play in promoting the fundamental principles of liberal democracy and justice. Social justice as an objective, and there are different ways of thinking about social justice. There's no one particular way. But if you pursue social justice, is there such a thing as social justice obtained without a process, through a process that doesn't include freedom of speech, open and free inquiry, due tolerance, due doubt, and in judgment in the end? That really is essential to the pursuit of any kind of justice in this world. And that's tied to the university's own pursuit of knowledge and truth. They kind of go hand in hand. And so the university, therefore, is a very vital university, the college, higher education. They are vital aspects of the American experiment. And if they falter, then America is going to be in trouble as well. Now, as my book chronicles, open and free inquiry on campus today has been inhibited for a variety of reasons. And I'm not going to go into them at any length here, but they're all in the book for you to look at. Why did I write this book? Because I saw the problem happening. But you'll note, I'm very careful, and maybe this is the driest part of the book. It might be the most boring part of the book. It's when I get into discussion of the empirical aspects of it. Because I had to show that, yes, indeed, it's reasonable to think there is a problem, but we don't want to overstate the problem. We don't want to understate the problem. So this is one of the few books that actually did tackle head on the empirical question, I call it. And I think once you look at that empirical evidence and how it's evolved over the years, a variety of levels, and since I wrote the book, even more so, yes, scientific organizations, major scholarly journals now have become much more subject to cancel culture and things like that. I think the problem has become even more widespread. At the same time, however, there's been more resistance. And of course, a large part of my book is about developing resistance to these challenges to free speech that have developed on campus. And many of them have come about. Student groups on campus, alumni and trustees and regents getting involved in it, and sometimes even politicians, that's a whole different question, because politicians have agendas we have to be very careful about. We want to limit political influence on campus as much as possible. But so right now, the debate is out there. It's in the air, and the book sort of contributes to it. I hope it does, at least to some extent. When I first came to Wisconsin, things were really pretty open. But then during the 1980s, speech codes started being developed across the land. Wisconsin was a pioneer in it. As I said, I even supported them because I believed in certain restrictions in speech in order to promote more respect for other people. And but as time went on, I could see the negative effects of how these codes were applied and adopted. And I started feeling kind of betrayed, that here's some of the most important issues of our age involving identity, involving certain scientific questions, were, because of the speech codes, were difficult to speak honestly and truthfully about according to one's own lights. And I said, well, did I go through all this graduate education and spend that money and, you know, work those hours to help pay for it in order to be inhibited when I taught classes that deal with those issues, which I did a lot. You know, I taught, you know, constitutional issues, Bill of Rights, criminal law and justice, things like that. I wanted to be able to probe these things and teach these things with a free and open mind. And I expected that in my students. And as a chilling effect developed on campus, I said, I've got to do something about this. And I got to find others who feel the same way, and we have to kind of bond together. And the book tells a story about how that worked at Wisconsin and how it has worked in some other places as well. Another reason I wrote the book, I mean, I just felt compelled to. It was like an existential thing. There's a book a woman named Kristen Monroe wrote about Holocaust survivors and people that protected them during the Nazi era in Germany and in Eastern Europe. And she wanted to find out what made some people protect Holocaust survivors and not others. And she went through, you know, is it education? Is it religion? Is it politics? And in the end, she said for most people, it was just a feeling they had to do it. And it's an existential thing. And she controlled for all these other factors that most social scientists would use. And she found they were not nearly as important. It's just the sense a particular person had. I got to do this. Well, I'm certainly not comparing myself or anyone in my movement to people that stuck their necks out to defend Holocaust survivors. I mean, that would be absurd. But it was the same kind of feeling that we felt obligated to start doing something about what we considered improper chilling of discourse on campus, which was lower rate education. And by the way, making education more boring. You know, I wanted to be excited about it. And I felt excited about it. I want my students to feel excited about it. And that's also another reason I did the book. I had just retired. I was working, as John mentioned, for IHS in Washington from afar. Once in a while, I'd go there and work with them. On the whole, it was from afar. And but nonetheless, I was kind of bored. And so writing the book was one way to address what I considered the growing boredom of higher education, because free inquiry was being inhibited, but also to deal with my own boredom. I'm certainly interested to think about the motivations for an author. They're often more complex than kind of meet the eye. And I've always thought that someone needs someday, maybe I'll do it. I doubt it. But someone should write a book about the history of boredom. I've never heard of it before, but the history of boredom, in which how boredom motivated certain people to do things. And I remember reading some stuff in the past where I took notes of it. Like, here would be an example of a person motivated by boredom, but I have no idea what I've done to those notes. But anyway, that was another reason for it. Okay, so what are my main objections in the book? Not an objection, excuse me, my major objectives. One was normative, to sort of present the story of what I've already been talking about here, why this matters, what higher education should be striving for, in addition to teaching the skills that people need to do to get jobs. The more intellectual adventure side of it and growth side of it. That was certainly a major part of it. And I stressed that, Norbert, especially in the chapter on why it matters. Then there was the empirical question. I wanted to get some hand on the empirical question, which of course can never be fully grasped because higher education, that's 4,000 institutions in America. And the story can be different in each one. In a big place like Wisconsin, the story can be different even in the same place. So what I try to do is paint a picture to give us a sense of probabilities, give us a sense of who has the burden of proof, In general, is there a problem that needs to be addressed without being alarmist? If I read through the book now, I'd have more evidence to be more alarmed, but also I'd have more evidence to be hopeful too, because of the resistance that's growing. So part of the book was that empirical question. And then 3, strategic. I was part of a really unusual movement here at Wisconsin. And we developed mobilization. We developed strategic acumen to make a difference in terms of campus policy and campus attitudes toward free speech. And I think for the large part, we were successful. It's a very unusual group. Plus, we defended 20 individuals who had been wrongly persecuted for what they said. And we basically won every case, or we settled on grounds very favorable based on the circumstances to the person. So those are the 3 main objectives of the book, and which make it somewhat unusual that it has those 3 dimensions. And in the end, I just wanted to sort of create an idea of a state of mind conducive to liberal education and the adventure it can be, and to help underpin the sort of foundational principles and practices of liberal democracy. So in a sense, liberal education and liberal democracy go hand in hand in the book. But they can't prevail unless they are defended. Freedom is not manna from heaven. It has to be defended. And John and I were talking before my talk about George Orwell in 1984, that if freedom is not defended when it's under threat, then you can slide into something. May not be as horrible as 1984. Clearly, America is not that. But you can move toward it. And that's not something we want to do. So I'm usually horrible at ending things. So I guess I would end with that John's talking about assigning Orwell in his classes. That's another way to be part of the remedy. So thank you.
Okay. I'd like to encourage can everybody hear me? I hope. Nod your heads if you can. Okay. Thank you, Lorelei. So I'd like to encourage questions here. You can either type a question in the chat at the bottom of the screen, or if you want to raise your hand virtually, I can put you on camera and you can ask Don whatever question you want to ask. As the host, I usually ask the first question, Don. So if a student, you mentioned John Stuart Mill a couple of times, if a student wanted to read some John Stuart Mill, what should they start with? Do you have a suggestion for them?
Yeah, well, it's certainly On Liberty is the classic work. Another work I would recommend is it's the autobiography of John Stuart Mill. Mill was an interesting character. He was a genius. He was reading Greek at the age of 3. I laugh when I say that because it's just so absurd. But his father was a very oppressive kind of guy that pushed him to do that very much. And he developed just his head and not his heart. And eventually he had a nervous breakdown. And it made him question everything. And he came out of it having a greater appreciation of the humanistic side of knowledge as opposed to the purely logical side of knowledge. And it also made him more appreciative of human emotion in addition to purely intellect. And the autobiography talks about that. And it also talks about how he changed his views about certain things over time and talked about he challenged kind of his idea on liberty by talking about the importance of community and people coming together as opposed to the heroic individual that is talked about in On Liberty. So it's sort of John Stuart Mill's introspection of himself in On Liberty later on. So I'd recommend that too. It's also a bit of an easier read than On Liberty, but On Liberty, of course, is the classic.
Yeah, and he also, for those of you in the audience, was a staunch advocate for women's rights, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
Good point. Good point.
Very early for that. So the first question from a student is, Lorelei, do you want to just ask the question? I
Hi. Yeah, what did you mean by the empirical question? Like a definition for that?
Good point. I didn't really explain that. Well, the empirical question is, how bad is the inhibition on free speech in higher education? Uh, some critics of people like me say we overstate the case. Some people thought my book was too kind, didn't go far enough. Maybe that means I got it right. I don't know, because I was criticized from both sides. But it's really, I'm concerned about codes and bureaucratic policies on campus, like anonymous reporting of things that are said in the classroom, which is now a big thing that's happening around the country. And it can just make everybody afraid to speak their mind because they could get reported. And even if nothing happens to you, you still have been reported. You may have to talk to some bureaucrat somewhere. So the question is how extensive and harmful these inhibitions really are on campuses. And that's a difficult question, like I said, because there are 4,000 institutions. Wisconsin's one, Lone Star is another, and you got 3,998 in between. So what you're looking for is the evidence you can gather and draw reasonable conclusions from it. So the empirical question really is, what is the nature of the problem and how extensive is it? Knowing that, you're never going to really get a perfect answer on that, which I think is sort of the theme of this talk too. You have to make the best judgment of it.
I mean,
Thank you.
we've got several students in the audience. I'd be interested to know, and Lorelai, you can answer if you want, but do you feel free to speak your mind here on campus? Give that some thought. Another question just came into the chat box, Don. Do you think this idea of reporting persons for things that they've said pushes us back to something like the early or mid 1950s? Could you comment on that?
Yeah, well, two comments. One is yes, it does. And it's certainly, it has a McCarthyistic aspect. It's a little different from McCarthy because in McCarthy's era, the danger came from outside the university. That was, the government and McCarthy. And the university, in too many cases, caved into it. Wisconsin is a classic example of a university that did not cave into McCarthy, even though he was just right down the block, he was from Wisconsin himself. He was our senator. So yes, it does it's reminiscent of that, of the McCarthy period. And but it's different because it's mostly coming from inside the campus. We're doing it to ourselves, which makes it a different kind of problem. In some ways even more oppressive. That would depend though on the case. The other issue is is it Orwellian? And the answer to that is yes. I mean, I can give you examples. FIRE is the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education. It's the leading free speech and academic freedom group in the country. And they sort of replaced the ACLU in that vanguard. And they're very close. Our group at Wisconsin worked very closely with them. Their founder came here and helped us with the faculty speech code issue. FIRE was partly based on a model similar to ours at Wisconsin, but on a national scale. So we're very much involved. I've always been very much involved with FIRE. And there's surveys on speech codes and campus policies, as well as student attitudes. Something like 70%, this is a round figure, of students in America today, college students, say that it's okay to report a professor for offending them in class. So this could just mean simply an idea that they find bothersome on some issue. This is so broadly defined that they also think it's appropriate to severely discipline, including firing that person. And if you know anything about the history of higher education or anything about how these things work, to threaten to fire someone for offending a student with an idea is the end of higher education. That's an enterprise in spirit. I find that shocking. And because you don't want an education where you're just told what makes you feel good. that's not the reason for going here. There's no growth in that. There's no excitement in that. There's no effort in that. It's just, it's not an education. So there you go. I could go on forever on that point, as you can imagine.
You talk a little bit in your, oh, okay. Yeah, thank you for that reply. The individual wrote.
Question. Thanks for both your questions so far.
Yeah. Please continue with the questions or raise your hand virtually if you can. What did you find most difficult about writing this book?
Well, one is a pretty mundane point. That's organization. I've always been, it's often, not always, but often been hard for me to get the right organization in terms of chapters. And once you get that down, then it kind of writes itself because I have all the ideas. And that took a little while. And then two, related to that is, especially the chapters on what a university is, I'm not sure what to make of those really. The second chapter, I'm not sure I would include it if I did it again. And the third chapter, I think, is more pointed into the point, talking about academic freedom and free speech. But without a clear sense of organization, you wander more than you should. And the first draft of this was, I would wander, I'd start talking about something and then talk about something else, and something else reminded me of, and there was less coherence to it. Doing a book, if you're doing a book and you researched a lot, you're still doing it while you write it. You got all this stuff that you've learned, and you want to put it into a package. And then in the book, you have to form it and make it into what you hope is a readable product. It's an art form of its own. And if you have a good editor, that really helps. And I had one at Cato. So that was probably the hardest part. The other part was getting it right in terms of balance between hope and, I don't want to say hopelessness, but between hope and deep concern. I didn't want the book to be like Chicken Little, the sky's falling. That may not be empirically accurate. So that violates the idea of truth. And then B, you're not going to encourage people to do something if the situation is already hopeless. This book was meant to try to encourage people to take up the cause. And there has to be some hope in that too. So that was another issue that I had to kind of get right in it.
Okay, this may be our time for our last question, Don. It's for Everett. Do you want to ask it, or would you prefer I go ahead and ask it for you? Says, with the more recent changes in education for youth, e.g. banning books, how does this affect free speech or honest disclosure in the classroom for today's youth?
Yeah, that's an important question. I mean, book banning is a bad thing. Now, this talk has been about higher education, and book banning in higher education, there should just be none of it, absolutely none of it. I'm involved with another group, another couple of projects where we've gone public about certain issues, and one of them is states that have passed rules against divisive concepts or divisive subject matter being taught. And we oppose that completely. It should be hands off the curriculum. If government wants to get involved with something, especially a state university, it's one thing to ban topics or ban books. It's another thing to protect free speech and to sort of add a program that broadens the intellectual horizon or the viewpoint diversity. That's constructive. That's pro-free speech. It's expanding it it's building on it rather than banning it. Once you get lower levels of education, the question becomes more complex. So, talking about sexuality and sexual identity to third graders is a different kind of question from talking about it with kids in high school. So there's kind of a sliding scale there. As long as you're really careful in your selection, if indeed a book consists of pornography, real pornography, certainly obscenity, and it's available for kids, if it's obscenity, and you have an appropriate law against obscenity, then that of course is something that shouldn't be on that shelf for kids. If it's highly pornographic but short of being obscene, then it's a matter of judgment. But the higher up you go in education, the more freedom has control over the question. We are on the side of freedom. But I think that, if you have really sexually explicit material for a third grader, if a parent doesn't like that, I understand that. I'm a parent.
All right, thank you. Well, if there are no more questions, I'd like to say thanks, Don, for everything you had to say today, and thank you for your book. And I hope that the students in the audience can continue thinking about these issues. You can find his book on Amazon, I'm sure. It's entitled Free Speech and Liberal Education, A Plea for Intellectual Diversity and Tolerance. And Lone Star College-Kingwood, the Curious Mind series, would like to thank you, Don, for speaking with us today.
Yeah, thank you, John. Thanks for the opportunity. Enjoyed it.
Everyone have a good day.
Yep, you too.
Thanks for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe for more content from LSC-Kingwood.